All right, it is Thursday, September 3rd, 2020, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger. Today, we're going to cover a wide range of topics, from Brock Lesnar being a free agent, Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal 2, the UFC Performance Institute in Shanghai being named the official training center for the Chinese Olympic Committee, and much, much more. So before we get started, always remember to like and subscribe to the Body Lock YouTube channel. Follow us at the Body Lock MMA on Twitter, and follow me specifically, if you wish, at All Day Auger, spelled Auger, on Twitter and Instagram as well. That in mind, let's go ahead and dive right in. So first thing I want to dive into here is Brock Lesnar's free agency and the negotiations that could take place between the WWE, the UFC, Bellator, whoever else may be interested. Now, this is something that seems to happen a lot with Brock. Whenever his contract comes up with the WWE, he often doesn't renegotiate while he's still under contract with them. He tends to let it lapse and then use some of these other entities, whether it's UFC or Bellator. You know, Scott Coker has mentioned something about having him come join Bellator, which we'll get to in a second. But basically, Lesnar is a businessman that has always, for the most part, let his contracts lapse and then pit bidders against each other so he can get the highest amount of money possible. It's a smart tactic, and he has and always will have, probably from here on out for the rest of his career, the ability to do that. He's a major draw in WWE. In UFC, he would be a major pull, especially right now during the pandemic. My guess is with that COVID bump that's still happening, he would be able to bring in some extra eyeballs, especially if it was a good matchup at heavyweight. Thinking Jon Jones or Francis Ngannou, some big fight like that could definitely get eyes on the UFC that would normally not care at all about it. So he tends to do this. He knows he has this bargaining power. But what also seems to happen almost every time is that he ends up going back to the WWE. Why? Well, for one, WWE has the financial resources to easily offer him better money than what he would make in the UFC. If you'll recall, when there was the tease about him fighting Daniel Cormier after Daniel Cormier had taken the belt off of Stipe for the first time at UFC 226, a big obstacle in those negotiations was the new UFC ESPN pay-per-view deal and the way that the pay-per-view points, so to speak, worked out. Because of that, Lesnar wanted a higher guaranteed rate, still wanted a nice cut of any pay-per-view buys for sure, but wanted a higher guarantee rate before he came back, and the UFC wouldn't budge. So he went back to WWE. He gets a very light schedule, gets to kind of, a lighter schedule for a wrestler, that is, but and ends up being able to take a lot of time off. He's not on the road all the time, and he's getting more money guaranteed per appearance. It made sense. Part of the reason why I don't believe he's coming back to the UFC is, even though there are a couple of interesting matchups, Jones especially right now could be, just a massive pay-per-view, hypothetically. If he comes back and he fights Jones, that's a really good fight to make in terms of getting the casual viewer to tune in. But I don't think he's going to come back for a couple reasons. One, the UFC probably still isn't going to give him the higher guarantee he wants, the flat rate he's looking for, in terms of coming back, plus the pay-per-view points. I don't think they're going to budge too much on that. Maybe they'll give him a little bit more, but for the most part, my guess is he's not going to get a higher rate than what he was offered back when they were trying to do the DC match. Two, he's gotten older and he's never, liked getting hit in the face. That's always been a thing, right? Is Brock Lesnar doesn't like to get hit, was the old adage. How much of that is true? Who knows? He did come back and he wrestled Mark Hunt. He got hit once or twice, but for the most part, just completely kept Hunt on the ground, was able to just stay there, do his work, came out with very little damage. But if he's going to come back now, there aren't too many matchups that make sense for a pay-per-view that wouldn't be threatening to him in terms of doing some damage, whether that's Jones, whether that's Ngannou, whether that's Curtis Blades. I mean, heavyweight is a much different place now than it was when they were talking about Lesnar versus DC back at 226. You still got Stipe there. You could do that match for the belt. I don't think Dana White would want that because my guess is Lesnar would not stick around and defend that belt. He would almost certainly drop it rather than going through some of those killers that are waiting in line. You could do Jones again, which is an amazing fight, but Lesnar is much more likely to take damage and lose that fight than, again, some of the opponents and options that he had before. I think DC would have ragdolled him if they had that fight as well, but, DC probably would have gone more to the ground, wouldn't have been all stand-up. Who knows, especially based on the way that these Stipe DC fights, went, that might not be the case. But I think it was a safer bet in his mind. Now, you're talking about doing a training camp at 43. You're talking about, really putting yourself through the rigor there and then taking possible punishment that you may not recover from as easily as you would have before. I don't think it's going to happen, especially with, yes, you take physical damage from WWE, but it's choreographed. He would have a say in what spots he gets to pick. So if he's not comfortable with a particular wrestler or with a particular move, he won't do it. That limits your actual physical damage quite a bit because you're picking spots that, if you have a weak knee, you can do a bunch of stuff to avoid that weak knee. In fighting, you can't do that. Wrestling, you can try your best to avoid it by picking certain spots and calling things and working with certain wrestlers where you are at less of a risk of getting injured from that. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think he will use the negotiation tactics and kind of pit the UFC against WWE, especially with Jones moving up to heavyweight. That's a great opportunity for him to say, hey, I've got Jones waiting over here. That's a massive pay-per-view buy. Why should I stick around WWE? But I think ultimately he'll end up back in WWE or maybe in AEW. I don't know AEW's model well enough to know if that'll work. I know they come from, the Khan family, which owns the Jacksonville Jaguars and all of that. They have plenty of money behind them that they could make an offer that Lesnar couldn't refuse. I don't know if they will, but I think the world of pro wrestling makes more sense than MMA. Scott Coker did entertain having Lesnar come and fight Fedor Emelianenko in Bellator, which would be a nostalgia fight for the ages, if there ever was one. But I can't imagine Viacom CBS shelling out the amount of money they would need to get Lesnar there. And if they did, I don't think they would get the return that they expect they would get. Would they get the highest ratings that Bellator's probably ever had in the longest time ever? Sure. If they went pay-per-view, I think they could do decent with pay-per-view buys with Fedor versus Lesnar. I'd agree there, but it's not going to be as enticing as Jones, and it's not going to be at the same level. I just don't see it personally, especially with Lesnar's relationship with Dana White and McMahon. It could happen because he is a businessman through and through, but I don't think that's where it's going to go. Another effect we should talk about this briefly, though, is the fact that we're still talking about Brock Lesnar and wondering what he's going to do. Yes, I'm talking about it here, and I know some of you are saying, well, if you didn't bring it up, people wouldn't be talking about it. Yes, that's true to an extent, but I'm not the first one to bring it up. Obviously, media's been all over it. ESPN's been all over it. People have been asking, "Ooh, he's coming back, or he might come back." Yeah, it's the fact that so many eyes are drawn and care about what Brock Lesnar does in MMA when he hasn't technically won a fight in 10 years. He did beat Hunt, but then he popped for steroids, so that was overturned. The fact, again, that we're bringing this up when he hasn't won a fight in 10 years, it really speaks to the superstar power and that effect. This is something that I imagine we will end up doing with Conor McGregor. He says he's retired right now. I don't think he's going to come back this year, maybe next year. We'll see. But my guess is whenever he wants to come back, even if he's older, even if he's, pushing 40, I think people are going to be like, whoa, McGregor says he might fight somebody. I think it's that same type of effect. When you hit a certain level of superstardom, it's always going to draw eyes. It's always going to keep the fans that love that nostalgia interested. And that's a lot of the casual viewers, right? That's a lot of the fans that maybe were watching, during the explosion of MMA, when, watching tap out, wearing tap out gear, watching MMA in college, or, 2010, 2011, they probably haven't watched it a long time. But, if they see, Lesnar versus Jones, I might tune into that. That's probably the only way they're going to, for some of those fans, it's probably the only way they're going to tune in, is for one of those names that they loved watching, 10 years ago. So we'll see what happens. I fully expect Lesnar, if I was betting money on it, I would fully expect Lesnar to go back to WWE, or at least stay in the world of pro wrestling. But, you never know. Maybe Dana gives him an offer he can't refuse. Maybe Bellator pulls out all the stops to get that Emelianenko match going. They have, Viacom and CBS have now merged. They have more money. They have the Showtime Sports. Technically Coca reports up to Dan Espinosa of Showtime Sports now. Maybe he believes that's an amazing fight. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But again, expect Brock Lesnar to stay in WWE world. Don't pin your hopes on him making an MMA return. Speaking of nostalgia, looks like we are getting Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz too. Now, this is an interesting fight. Dana has said that I'll probably be for the BMF belt again, which is because I would have thought that, well, let me step back a second. Dana had a BMF belt was a one-time thing. I think we all knew that was maybe, speaking a little too soon, depending on how well the pay-per-view did, depending on how well Masvidal did, who knows. But you would think technically that belt would have been eradicated or unified, so to speak, with Usman once Usman beat Masvidal. I guess not. I guess they're bringing it back again for another gimmick. And Diaz in a rematch is interesting in a lot of ways because, as many people have pointed out, Diaz got clearly beat. Yes, the fight probably got stopped a little bit too early based on that cut. In my opinion, Diaz is got to. That's just going to happen every fight. If you're going to have a ref call a fight for that, it's probably going to happen again. He's taken so much scar tissue. He always bleeds. It's a thing that happens, and I don't think it was. I'd have to go back and rewatch it. At the time, I didn't think it was a bad enough cut that it should be stopped, but I also don't think not stopping the fight would have made a huge difference. I am not of the core belief that, if Diaz had into those later rounds, Masvidal would have gassed and Diaz would have suddenly pulled it out of nowhere. It's possible, but in my opinion, Diaz was getting outstruck everywhere. And he doesn't like to go to the ground that much. He wasn't going in for takedowns, shooting, setting up feints, doing things that may have caused Masvidal a little bit of trouble. No, he was trying to box Masvidal, and Masvidal just straight boxed him. So I know from that standpoint, it's not the most exciting rematch. I know from that standpoint, a lot of people agree that it's kind of like, really? Like, you're not going to get anybody else in there? Why not do Conor? Why not do, well, besides Conor not being available, a big part of this is, one, getting Nate Diaz back to the table, because he is a draw. So, after that fight, he was upset about the doctor stoppage, kind of just left and made it sound like, who knows, maybe he's done forever, maybe like in 2 years, classic Nate Diaz. This gets him back at least, which, if he starts fighting regularly again, he's a draw. He's a bona fide draw ever since he beat McGregor. So that would be huge to get Diaz back to fold and fighting regularly. Two, it's what at this point with Masvidal, what else do you do? You could set up the Leon Edwards fight. You could go that route, but if Edwards beats Masvidal, they had a little bit of heat with each other when they had that backstage brawl, cut him open, but that was a long time ago, and that he's kind of died down. You could do Covington, but he's already booked against Woodley, could wait and then do Covington. But again, the heat on that has died down a little bit. That one, I think, is still in play in terms of a good fight for Masvidal and Covington, both in terms of fan interest and things going on. But right now he's booked, and who knows if Masvidal wants to deal with another wrestler. My guess is Covington would do a lot of what Usman did to Masvidal. Just wrestle him, hold him down, decision him. I know Masvidal said had he had a full camp that, it would have gone differently, but there was nothing I saw his past performances where he's, historically struggled with wrestlers or with ground game, really. I don't think it really would have gone that much different, and I don't think it would go that much different. So if you're the UFC here, Masvidal is clearly a draw. They got a big bump in pay-per-view for Masvidal versus Usman almost entirely on Masvidal's side, not really because Usman is a draw based on some of the social media metrics, some of the other metrics in play. It was clearly Masvidal pulling all of that after Diaz. If you send him in matchups at welterweight where he gets beat cleanly, Wonder Boy, right? You could do that rematch, but Wonder Boy just schooled him last time at UFC 217. Very possible that happens. It's, I think that's a bad stylistic matchup for Masvidal, just in terms of Wonder Boy's technique. He still looks amazing. Yes, he got finished by Anthony Pettis, but that was shot. He was crushing Pettis up until then. He's beaten Luque since then pretty soundly. He's still very good. Wonder Boy is still in the top 5 in my opinion of the division. So again, you do Masvidal versus Wonder Boy, you do Masvidal versus Cutton, Masvidal versus Edwards, and he loses. I don't think you're going to name star power transfer rub in terms of, that guy beat Masvidal, now he's a star. Doubt that's going to happen unless it's crazy emphatic fashion. They go on a great post-fight speech, who knows. And secondly, you're not going to get the juice out of Masvidal that you have right now, right? Like, since he beat Diaz, he's had one fight. And that fight clearly showed his drawing power. Clearly, showed, okay, if we put him against somebody else, like another guy like McGregor or somebody else, this could be really big. If he goes out there and loses one of those other guys, then especially like in a boring decision, that's star talent wasted that Masvidal now has. He's kind of broken through so that he's partially in the mainstream. He's been on ESPN. He's been on other shows. He has some mystique around him. Losing that would be waste in terms of the UFC having someone now that isn't going to be Conor McGregor, may not even be Nate Diaz. Who knows? It's only had one fight, but he has a lot of juice and a lot of drawing power. Getting him in a fight decision poorly, that would kill. Masvidal needs some wins. Masvidal needs some fun fights. Even if he loses, they need to be fun and exciting in order to keep that alive and kind of grow his star power, or at least maintain it so he can get these pay-per-view buys. And a fight with Diaz does that perfectly. A, it's a guy he's already clearly beat. B, it's another big name that a lot of casual viewers, for the Nate Diaz hardcores out there, that was like, oh, if it had gone to the later rounds, who knows? I mean, that this will, get them to watch 100%. And it even for those of us looking at this and saying, why, he just clearly beat him, why are you doing it again? In the long run, it's going to show that he beat Diaz twice, and that will look impressive on his resume. 6 months, year after that fight, if he beats Diaz twice, that's going to look impressive. It's going to look very impressive, especially when McGregor technically hasn't done that yet. He had a close majority decision win over him, and he lost once. So that kind of adds to some of the mystique to Masvidal and resets him so that he has some time to maybe work on some of his other tactics to beat somebody like Usman or Covington or Wonder Boy. And that's important because it keeps that drawing power alive. So the UFC is putting this match together, I think, for those two big reasons: is getting Nate Diaz back at the table so they can utilize him in other matches, and keeping Masvidal power alive. Is it the most fun stylistic? I mean, we've already seen it, and it wasn't long ago. So, maybe it's a little bit more competitive, but it might just be Masvidal outboxing Diaz again. Is it going to have that same feel of like, oh, it's the BMF belt and all that? No, of course not. Even though BMF belt is up for grabs and that's part of the gimmick, it's not going to be the same feel, not going to be the same excitement for most, especially the hardcores, but for most fans. But will it keep two historical, cash cows, so to speak, even if they're not McGregor or GSP or whatever level, even if they're not that level, is going to keep them still in the game? Yes, no matter win or lose. Because even if Diaz loses again, I think he's well on his way to having that Lesnar status of doesn't matter. We want to see him fight. So we'll see what happens, but I again think that is why they are putting this together. And if Diaz wins, then you have a great trilogy set up. I mean, come on. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how that fight goes. Hopefully it's entertaining, but that is why, from the business side, why they're doing Nate Diaz versus Masvidal 2. All right, now I want to pivot here and talk about something that's been making the rounds, which is DC, Daniel Cormier, talking with Ariel Helwani about his retirement, hanging up the gloves for good. He's done fighting, but mentioning in a conversation with Ariel Helwani that he received a $1 million discretionary bonus for the UFC when he fought Jon Jones. We've known about discretionary bonuses for a long time now. Through the UFC lawsuit, through the leaked documents of the sales presentation when the UFC was itself to Endeavor, discretionary bonuses are something that's been around the UFC for a long time and will most likely continue to be there. As far as I've heard from my sources, they're still around. I don't know if they're the same level that they used to be, but they're definitely still there. So when you look at DC saying, yeah, I got $1 million and they've been nothing but good to me and all of that, Goddard has been a company guy. I don't know if he had started commentary yet when he got that $1 million bonus. I know if he hadn't, he was at least in talks to do commentary because those talks were running for quite a long time. But it's something where it shouldn't surprise anyone that DC is singing the praises of the UFC, especially now since he is a commentator, right? This is everybody saying, including which John Nash has covered, finances. If you watch the show, you know who John Nash is, you know who Jeff and Jason Cruz are. And John Nash brought up that, yes, he got $1 million, but compared to the pay-per-view revenue that he did, that's very low. I would agree. I mean, there's that study by Dr. that I've written about in terms of fighter marginal revenue product, and talks about how much fighters actually generate in terms of revenue position in the rankings based on their title fights, things of that nature. Yeah, DC, $1 million is nice, but not as much as he actually made for the company, which you wouldn't expect to get the whole thing, but even a percentage wise, he probably got a small percentage of what he actually generated being on the other side of Jones, especially because of their rivalry. So while that is all true, you've got to remember that DC is still working for the UFC, right? That's still his boss. He is a commentator now. He is doing commentary on fight nights, pay-per-views. He was just on Dana White's Contender Series. He's doing promotion with ESPN. He's got the show with Ariel Helwani. UFC is still his boss. Even if he was like, I should have made more, right? He's not going to say that. When you get a bonus at work, even if you believe you should have made more, you don't publicly go around and say, yeah, no, they gave me this bonus, but man, I really wish they would have given me my cheapskates. It's not what you do. So I'm not sure that DC actually feels that way. I think he probably doesn't. I think he has had such a great relationship with the UFC that he really is grateful for the amount of money that he received. I mean, he thought $1 million was huge at the time. You know, I believe all that. But even if he didn't, he's never going to say otherwise. Yes, he freely volunteered that information, but he freely volunteered it on a show that promotes the UFC with a main broadcast partner, really the face of the main broadcast partner in terms of MMA in Ariel Helwani. That's not surprising at all. That's not at all. It's to me, again, it's crazy that some people are like, what a shill and all this. Like, I guess technically, yeah, but he's still employed by them, right? Right? It's still his boss. So I wouldn't read that much into it. I wouldn't say that DC is saying that this is enough money and that all fighters should be getting this pay and all that. I John Nash and others that it is, you know, fraction compared to what he generated for the company, and he probably deserved more depending on, you know, the agreements they had, all of that. I would have assumed he deserved in terms of he generated enough money for that, but do not be shocked by this, and do not assume that DC is actually that happy about his money. Is it possible? Yes. That's my inkling, but we don't know. And again, it's his boss. So like he's never going to admit anything otherwise while he's working for them. What'll be interesting to me is if he comes out years after he's done commentating, he's done with the UFC. Honestly, you know, then I'd be interested to say, like, do you still believe all that? Do you still think $1 million was enough based on how much money they were making and all of that? Especially if we get more financials from the UFC lawsuit. Is it really? But until then, I mean, he's still a boss. You know, expect more of the same. Don't go overboard with this. Another thing I want to talk about here is the rash of Contender signings, right? That I see a lot of people talk about as well. Dana White Contender Series commentators are saying, yeah, everybody's getting a contract. This goes back into part of what Dana said during the second week of Dana White Contender Series during the post-fight presser, where he said, yeah, we have to, you know, cut some guys because we're signing all these new guys and this is a whole big thing. I still believe there is some truth to that. I do believe we will see more releases, especially from some of those mid-tier guys, as I've mentioned before on this podcast. I think that's probably going to happen. But I want to just be clear here in terms of signings. So far, after 5 weeks, we've had 19 signings, which is a lot, especially with the amount of people that have rolled through. You also have some people, last week, everyone was either given a contract, or the two that weren't are invited back in November and might win a contract then. So it certainly seems like a lot of Dana White Contender Series signings. But it's also important to remember that part of that is them touting, hey, we're signing all these people and this is crazy. If you go back and actually look at the numbers from last year, 2019, even if they didn't sign them right away, you know, you have, and actually, no, looking at it, they had 17 signings through 5 weeks. 17. So we're talking about 2 more fighters than usual. Is it still a way for the UFC to sign lower contract guys and then cut some of the older ones who could probably still find the UFC but aren't going to make a title run, aren't going to generate a buzz or hype, and their later deals where they're making more money? Yeah, of course. This has been. But it's not like, whoa, 2020 is the year of a billion people getting added and we're seeing a massive thinning out of the roster. I still think there's going to be releases. More releases than there already has been. I think there will be maybe a little bit more than usual because some of that lost revenue and the way the UFC works, where if they're losing revenue pretty much anywhere, they're always looking at a way to make it up in some form or fashion. And fighters, especially those fighters who are in that mid-tier but not really going anywhere, that's an easy target for them. So I still think we'll see that, but it's not that they've signed a billion guys. It's literally 2 more than last year up to this point. And, you know, it's true that we're seeing these guys show up more often in regular fights, right? You had Impa Kasangane win the Contender Series 2 weeks later. He's fighting. That's going to happen. They've already, you know, they're in a camp where you don't getting pulled last minute or worry about travel or this craziness, because they are probably still in Vegas or in the area they need to be, where, it's likely they're now going to catch COVID. That's a huge factor in why you're seeing so many guys get recycled on these cards, right? Like I think Brian Kelleher now it's been his third or fourth fight coming up. I want to say third since the quarantine started. There's been Roosevelt Roberts has been on multiple cards. There's been you've seen some faces that keep showing up on these cards at either the Apex or Fight Island or what have you. And a big part of that is, yes, they know that they're probably good COVID wise and medical wise, right? Remember, you have to do not just COVID, you have to do other medical tests. And that's probably a burden on the UFC to go out there for someone that hasn't fought since this whole thing began and get the other medicals processed, while those same labs are probably backed up by COVID tests and other things going on. So you've got that all to deal with. With these guys, the medicals are probably good and most likely going to stay good. And then, yes, they're lower pay, which is good for the UFC. While they can't bring in the gate, while they can't do the arenas and get the revenue that they might get from hosting events in different cities, this is a way for them to keep costs low rather than bringing in guys all over the place. Does that mean that it will stay this? Because of the way the contracts work for the UFC, right? You have to offer so many fights. Otherwise, UFC would be in breach of contract. So we will get people cycling in and out. We will see new faces. I don't think it's sustainable to have some of these guys fight everything out until the pandemic's done. That's just not going to happen. But I would imagine in a place like, say, Fight Island, where you have everybody come all at once, you can bring some backup fighters, and then you have strict quarantine rules. My guess is when Fight Island, everybody heads out to Fight Island, that's when you're going to see a bunch of new faces, because then they have really good controls in place. You didn't see a lot of pullouts at all at Fight Island. You had pretty much a lockdown. You had stringent quarantines. You had a bubble. That type of scenario is where they're going to be offering fights to, a lot of these mid-card guys that they owe fights to. So it all ties together in the sense that, yes, they are signing a lot of people on Contender Series, but it's not that much more. And the reason you're seeing them fight more often is because of the medical and the pay of the overall cards to keep event ratios the same, fighter pay and revenue. It's not, we're gutting the roster and using all these young guys. That narrative is out there. I know some outlets have kind of framed it as, is this what's happening? No, it's not. It's not. If we go through the rest of the Contender Series and all of a sudden it's everybody gets a contract and then they're cutting, you hear about, roster cuts in some form or fashion every couple of weeks. Okay, then maybe there's some legs to that. But right now it's literally just as usual with the UFC pivoting because of their situation with the pandemic. That's all. It's not everyone's getting cut. We're spending all these, we're signing all these new guys, and it's event revenue or event cost low forever. That's not the case. So in some other interesting news, the South China Morning Post MMA team, which if you aren't following those guys, you definitely should. They've got some great interviews, great info, especially about the Asian MMA out there. They're killing it. Definitely check them out. JHK, who used to write for us. If you don't know who JHK is, well, you need to figure that out. But he write for us, do some videos for us. He's a lot of work down there. Does Kumite TV. Definitely look. But so they reported recently that the UFC Performance Institute in Shanghai is going to be the official training center of the Chinese Olympic Committee, and that they've essentially worked out a deal for Chinese athletes, Olympic athletes, to train there, utilize those facilities, and kind of come to a partnership in that regard. This is big news in a couple ways. One, that's a great deal for the UFC in terms of building that relationship with China. I've talked about on this podcast, as well as through some pieces I did a while back, about how, their deal with China was massive when Weili Zhang ended up getting the title. They had negotiated, these great media rights. Zhang won the title, and then they were able to renegotiate to leverage that a lot more. They had the UFC Performance Institute in Shanghai when that opened. That was around the same time that they had Zhang versus Andrade at title fights. I think specifically as kind of a like, hey, we're in China, we're showcasing Chinese athletes. It was a big deal. Their partnership has grown, especially from the 1 or 2 cards that they put on a year in China to now really building a partnership between the media, the government, now the Olympic Committee. And that's great for them, especially with the way that Chinese GDP and, economics are going or projected to go in the future. That relationship is going to really help out the UFC. If they can get an even stronger foothold in there, really become, a staple of the regular Chinese citizen life, where that's what you do for sport is you watch, hey, I'm going to turn on MMA, and it becomes, kind of a regular sport that they watch. That's massive. Now that's, not to say that they don't watch NBA, MLB, any of that stuff right now. No, of course they do. But if they can, Chinese fighters like Weili Zhang, like Li Jiangliang, who I believe lost his last fight and it's kind of in right outside the top 15 at welterweight. But if they can build up some of these national fighters there, that's a big ploy for them to grab more of the Chinese market. I mean, when you're talking about the searches when Zhang won that belt from Andrade, the searches on Weibo, which is the equivalent of Twitter, but it's a state-run app that they use in China. Zhang was trending off the charts. It was, I believe, number 1 in terms of trending. That's huge. That's something where if the UFC can capitalize on that, building that relationship that way, I mean, that's revenue that they haven't even seen yet, which is bonkers to think about given how much revenue they're already bringing in. That would be a whole new level. So this partnership with the Chinese Olympic Committee is big in that it further that, and it helps get them into a more symbiotic relationship with the Chinese government, which is great. That's something in terms of business for them, because that's a huge market again, as I've just, and by having the athletes train there, that also gives the UFC an opportunity to kind of, nudge if they want. I don't know that though, but nudge the Olympic, the International Olympic Committee a little bit in terms of making MMA a sport for the Olympics. That's something that's been pushed by the IMMAF for a while. It's been pushed by a couple of other promotions trying to make MMA an official Olympic sport. It's gotten shot down several times. This kind of gives them a little bit of an opening, the UFC, if they want it, where they could start to say, look, your athletes train here. It will expose them more to mixed martial arts. It will, kind of make it seem like mixed martial arts and the other Olympic athletes are not on the same level, so to speak, in terms of, the overall exposure and the overall view of that. But it will be a nice juxtaposition for MMA athletes. In terms of, there's a lot of stigma around MMA athletes from a lot of people that don't follow the sport. Putting them next to and training with other Olympic athletes is going to soften that kind of harsh view of MMA is cockfighting and MMA is, blood sport and is a giant circus. This kind of softens that idea. So again, that helps the UFC's image immensely in their partnership, but it also opens the door for, as the IMMAF, pushes to get MMA in the Olympics. And as they make that case, they can say, ask some of your Olympic athletes from, and China could say, yeah, well, no, we've seen their athletes. Yes, it's a bloody sport, but it's, it's a real sport. China could hypothetically push to allow MMA in, especially if MMA grows in popularity in China. That's something the government may want to capitalize on. So again, that will happen. The UFC probably wouldn't let any of big superstar athletes compete in the Olympics. You might have some lower level guys for sure get to go. I could see that, especially could make some interesting cross promotional fights if you had some lower level or mid tier guys in Bellator and won, and everybody go to the Olympics fighting for their country. That could be interesting, but they're never going to let their champions or any of their ranked guys go because they don't. That it's the same reason they'll never do cross promotional bouts. There is no incentive for them to have this because of the perception that they are already the best in the world. There's no incentive for them to have their guys go and fight other promotion fighters. If they beat them, it's expected. And if they lose, it makes C look bad and that other promotion look better. So they're not going to happen. They're not going to send any top 15 guys, any champions over to the Olympics. But they might send some lower level guys who maybe they've just signed off Contender Series. They've had fight once or twice on some fight nights. They could send or allow those guys to go. I could see that. But either way, it's a big step in the right direction towards getting MMA at the Olympics. Because if athletes in China and the Chinese Olympic Committee review this partnership after a while, this is great, and we've gained a newfound respect for these guys, and they've been a huge partner for us. It's not unfair for China may say, no, we actually think MMA should be in the Olympics, especially if it booms as a sport in China, because that's, again, great for the government in terms of having a sport that they can get behind and push. That's not a bad thing. So we'll see where it goes. Again, I know I've been saying that a lot on this show today. I'm sorry. I've been a long day, but yeah, we'll see what happens and if it actually, pushes anything in that right direction. But either way, it certainly opens the door, and any which way you cut it, this is good for the UFC in terms of publicity and market share in China, especially because right now there are very few competitors out there in the Chinese market. So it's a win for the UFC. We'll see if it ends up being a win for MMA in the Olympics. All right, last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up here is that Nurmagomedov has announced a partnership with a group called MMA Global Holdings, who is looking to create a promotion that is structured similarly to the PFL with a season, playoffs, things of that nature, and that will hold events in TV studios with live studio audiences. Seems to be not going for the UFC or even PFL level or Bellator level of notoriety, trying to really compete with groups like maybe LFA, Cage Warriors, things like that. And they are currently offering an opportunity for fans to invest in the company. If you go to their website, they've talked about the launch. They've talked about Khabib being the face and offering training, it looks like. They haven't given specifics on Khabib's enrollment other than he is getting compensation and he is acting as a brand ambassador. But it looks like at this point, he will be involved in some executive or advisory board capacity. And you can go to their website and they're offering fans or potential fans to invest in the company. That's a very interesting way to do this. A lot of people, a lot of fans talked about how when Endeavor was looking about going public, they might invest because, it's the UFC. Or if the UFC ever decided to go public on its own, which we can talk about some other time because it's been talked about a million times, that they would probably buy it because it's the UFC. They're doing awesome. Of course we'd invest. This kind of allows fans or would-be fans to get in on the floor of a promotion that hypothetically could end up a big deal, especially if they're trying to compete with kind of the minor leagues of MMA. Will it? No. It's way too early to say whether or not they will get anywhere with this. There are too few details. Their biggest, information PR move out there so far has been Khabib saying, hey, you can invest with us, which is great to have Nurmagomedov as the face of this. I draw a lot of people in, but nobody knows really knows yet. Nobody knows who's really a part of this. That I'm sure will be revealed as goes on as they get set up. But getting it on the ground floor of something like this could potentially be one, could go great if it ends up, becoming something very, or something that can compete in that marketplace. It could really get fetched, right? Because if I have stock in this particular company, this particular MMA promotion, you best believe I'm watching all the time or trying to buy their gear, promoting on their own. So that gives them a little bit of free advertising, but it also is an interesting way to raise funds for MMA Global. I mean, that's something no one has really offered to my knowledge. It's possible that some of those, promotions, they offered something like this, but I can't recommend that fans could just actively invest in a MMA promotion and become a shareholder. It could work in terms of getting, fans or would-be fans signed up, especially with Nurmagomedov as the face. I could see a lot of people saying, yeah, I'd throw $20 in there, $40. I forget what the share price is. It's kind of, from what I've seen, it kind of looks like it's you donate what you can. Or actually it might be $50, I believe. I'll have to double check that, but definitely, the regular guy off the street can buy a share of stock if they want. And that's an interesting way to try and raise funds to get this off the ground. Typically, promotions will go to venture capitalist firms. They'll go to big time investors. You had PFL going to, the Washington Wizards owner, The Rock, Kevin Hart. You had UFC get investment from get investment from Mark Wahlberg and Tom Brady, all those people. Typically, when you're going for fundraising, you're looking at VCs or private equity or, angel investors that have a bunch of money to fund this type of venture and where it goes. By going to the fans, I'll be very curious to see if they end up raising a significant amount of money from this. My guess, not as much as, well, okay. I would bet money it will not be as much as something like a VC or, a big time investor like The Rock or something like that. But I don't know how significant it will end up actually playing in the long run there. My guess is it will be a couple percentage points, but it's not going to be, where it's not going to be a situation where you have fans being able to vote collectively and really potentially cause havoc within the company because they have enough, shares that they can make some big decisions if they all vote together. I don't see that happening. And I don't see it as the fans have raised all this money and then to bring you these fights and have the promotion be up and running. They might be that way. I wouldn't be surprised if they marketed it that way, but it's not going to, I can't imagine a scenario where it was fan money that really got everything to the point where it was able to get off the ground and running, and not some type of investment firm or big angel investor or something like that. So it's an interesting concept. I am curious to see where it ends up. If it does take off when they're looking to start, it looks like it probably won't start until next year. And again, the format is going to rival that of the bat. Will be interesting to see how PFL deals with their first technical rival in terms of, format with a regular season, playoffs, all that. But yeah, it kind of came out of the blue. Nurmagomedov tweeted it's something that flew under the radar and then has now gotten a little bit of light shown on it. I would guess it gets more attention, especially if it picks up and Nurmagomedov is doing more and more work with it. But we'll see. It's an interesting way to raise funds and something that I thought was pretty cool to see an MMA promotion as a business. So maybe everybody will be wearing a global MMA gear in the next year or so. Who knows? All right. We're going to go ahead here. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and any medium you've used to consume. I greatly appreciate it. You can, listen to us at Spotify, Apple Podcast, ones we go through Anchor FM. So we're pretty much everywhere for audio purposes. Of course, you can catch us on the Body Lock YouTube channel. please, we really do appreciate that. And if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, any feedback at all, by all means, please let me know. I've gotten some feedback recently that I love, and I'm trying to incorporate it. I'd love to do more fan interaction with you guys. So if you have, any segments or any things you'd like me to cover, hit me up. But otherwise, I will catch you guys later, and save out there.